So welcome everyone to this evening's talk with Alexandra Hall. I'd just like to first of all give you a little bit of idea about how this will work. Alex will talk for about 10-15 minutes and then we'll have a discussion. In the discussion, if you can send your questions in via the chat box, that would be great. And in that, when you send your question, ask if you'd like to be unmuted to ask the question in person, or if you'd prefer for me or Kahir to read it out, that would be fantastic. And we are recording this. We're hopefully going to share it on our YouTube channel later, and just let you be aware of that as well. So with that, I will stop sharing the slide and hand you over to Alex. I'll just say a little bit about Alex. She probably doesn't need an introduction from many of you, but Alexandra is a former diplomat, probably most famous for resigning in 2019 from a position at the US Embassy. In dismay at the half-truths and not totally honest messages she was being required to deliver. I think by those descriptions, she showed that she was still a diplomat at that point, at that stage. I hadn't given up the habits yet. She's also had a very wide diplomatic experience before that, including, and this is probably something we might touch on today, a position as ambassador to Georgia. She's now a patron of the European movement, writer for the Byline Times, a co-host of the Disorder podcast, an advisor to Eurasia Foundation, and a member of the Commission on Political Power. So keeping herself busy in the post-diplomatic era. So with that, I will hand over to Alex.
Okay, so thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you so many people for joining. I guess we're all desperately hoping for some good news, which is why we've got such a good turnout. Because I'm really amazed to see so many of you here. And I deliberately set myself the title, Is There Any Good News? Because I think there's so much bad news around. I think it's very easy for a lot of us to feel very, very depressed. And I thought, well, I'm going to test myself and see if I can come up with something more positive and encouraging. And actually, even today, and just in the last 30 minutes, as I was coming on air, we've had two really fantastic bits of good news. And one is, as you probably know, that it looks like we finally got a deal between Israel and Hamas in Gaza, potentially leads to the release of Israeli hostages and a phased end to the war in Gaza. So I think that's just an amazing bit of good news. And then also I was following Mike Galsworthy, the esteemed president of the European movement, who was posting like crazy today about the vote on a youth mobility scheme. Sorry, the vote in the House of Commons on a youth mobility scheme, and apparently that passed today, so it goes to a second reading. So I think, you know, those are two good bits of good news. But when I was structuring this talk, and I was thinking, how do I kick this off? And the first thought that came into my head was something that happened with my kids. About 10 years ago, I had a 5-year-old kid who was constantly getting into trouble in kindergarten. And his teachers were constantly sending home to me little notes saying, Tommy did this and Tommy did that. And Tommy was running outside the bathrooms, or he was talking in class or whatever. So I was getting more and more frustrated. And I met him off the school bus and I said, Tommy, how was your day today? Was it any better? And he said, yeah, Mum, yes, it was quite good. And I thought, this is great. And then he said, but mostly bad. And I just thought, so quite good, but mostly bad. And I thought that kind of sums up trying to assess the state of the world today. I think there are still some quite good things happening, but it is against a mostly bad context. And a lot of the good things that I'm going to suggest are happening as a result of people deciding to push back against the bad things. And so the overall context is not that great, but there's still life and hope out there. And I don't think I need to run through for this group here all the sort of bad and worrying things because they tend to dominate our headlines and our newspapers. I mean, I suspect all of you share the sense that the world has become a somewhat chaotic and disordered place. It feels very uncertain. You've got countries like Russia invading Ukraine. You've got China making claims on Taiwan and the South China Seas. The international organizations like the UN, the OSCE, the World Trade Organization are deadlocked. Ideological conflicts hampering agreement, even in organizations like the EU, where countries like Hungary and Slovakia see Europe's security position through a different lens than other established states like France and Germany. You've got the hideous wars in the Middle East, Ukraine, Sudan, and loads of other places that barely rate a mention these days. Burma is one that's dear to my heart, since that was my very first job in the Foreign Office. Coups in Africa, environmental stuff, global warming, ice caps melting. Okay, so this is all not great. Unregulated social media. Is AI a good thing or a bad thing? Disinformation. And I have to say that against that context, just sort of personalizing it, I'm not actually that surprised to read that birth rates are falling around the world as well, which in some ways is a bad thing because I think birth rates are falling because people don't feel confident about the world into which they might be raising their kids, even if they could have kids, because fertility is dropping off as a result of chemicals and microplastics. And if they could afford to, because if you're a young person, the economy's not looking that promising. On the other hand, you could say a falling birth rate, maybe that's a good thing longer term for the planet. But right now, I would say it's a sign of a lack of confidence in the future. And in this sort of scary and disordered world, you know, the powers that have usually helped maintain some kind of order, whether it was the UK in the 19th century and the United States in the 20th century and the first part of this century, or the EU and these sort of ordering groupings, NATO, they don't look in great shape. And now you've got coming into the White House Donald Trump, who I think if you're a liberal progressive like me and someone who benefited from growing up in the sort of post-World War era and the rise of these sort of institutions that seem to provide some stable framework. And now we have Trump, who doesn't care about international rules. He doesn't care about international institutions. He doesn't really distinguish between America's traditional allies and some of its traditional enemies. He treats with disdain partners in NATO, countries to the north of him like Canada and Mexico to the south, even though they have a trade deal together. And he's nominated some pretty ghastly people to his cabinet. So it's not great, that context, but I still think there are some grounds to feel relatively hopeful or not to lose all hope, even if, as I said at the beginning, a lot of the good things, which I think people have identified as happening, are a reaction to some very bad things. Now, when I was once we'd agreed on the title of this talk, I thought one thing I would do is ask for a friend. So I put out on my social media, including Twitter, although one good thing is I have now deleted Twitter. I've now decided I'm going to get rid of my Twitter habit. So I've only been able to see the answers on Blue Sky, but I did put out there, look, I'm giving this talk. Are there any good stories out there? Can anybody help me? And I did get quite a lot of really good suggestions, and some of them I'm going to draw on in this. But the ones that I really liked were actually quite small and quite local. And my absolutely favourite reply came from Guy, and I don't know if Guy's on this call, but he said, there's always good news. Just take a look at what normal people are up to, helping each other, working in the service industries, looking out for their neighbours, etc. ignore global developments. Good stuff is at arm's reach. And I thought that was a really nice place to start, because there's still a lot going on at the good local level, and that is within our control. We still have agency, even if the rest of the world appears to be a scary place. We still have agency, and we can still make good things happen in our local level. And people provided a few examples. So currently, 20 local authorities across the UK have signed up 20,000 kids for free school meals. Somebody mentioned that Cumbria Wildlife Trust has bought the Skiddaw Forest. Someone mentioned that schools in Colchester ran a programme where kids were banned from mobile phones for 21 days, and it had amazing results. And I'm pleased to say that my kids' schools here in the States have also banned mobile phones. So people are sort of reacting, and they are doing things on a local level. A lot of people mentioned environmental initiatives. Someone said there's an initiative using empty wine bottles to rebuild coastlines. So you can drink a lot and feel like you're doing something good for the environment. Somebody mentioned that more seals are breeding on the East Coast because offshore wind farms have provided a new footing there for underwater vegetation. And in that vegetation, new fish nurseries are developing. So I quite like that. There's a lot of creativity and innovation into renewable energy, making it more affordable. So that's something to be hopeful about. We're constantly hearing of new medical advances. There's been a lot happening on Alzheimer's, for example, early detection and treatment. New vaccines that came into force as a result of the pandemic are now being considered as potentially useful for other conditions. So there are lots of sort of good things like that on the local level, but just sort of sketching back out on the geopolitical level, it may seem like, our world order is crumbling and that democracies are on the back foot. But I will just sort of throw it out there that authoritarian regimes aren't having it all go their way either. And arguably, they're actually in a worse shape than we are. I mean, take a look at Russia. Russia has suffered massively as a result of its invasion of Ukraine. First of all, it didn't win. Secondly, it prompted a lot of European countries to divest and to wean themselves off Russian oil and gas. Thirdly, the Russian economy had to completely retool itself to pour money into military production, and so it's hurting its own economy. It's also increased Russian dependence on China, and that's a very uneasy relationship. And Russia's been forced to find very dubious friends like Iran and North Korea, neither of which are particularly stable or reliable partners. And for example, I was just reading in the Wall Street Journal today that North Korea is suffering so many losses in the battlefield in Ukraine that arguably there will be tensions between North Korea and Russia, because the North Korean regime will say you're using our elite troops like cannon fodder. So Russia is not actually getting things all their own way. And amazingly, Ukraine, 3 years on, is still holding on. I mean, there is still Ukraine. There is still going to be a Ukraine, even if Trump insists on a peace deal that does reward Putin for some of his aggression. Ukraine itself still exists and arguably has a better chance now of actually making it into the EU and possibly even NATO as well. NATO has 2 new members, Finland and Sweden. And defence expenditure in NATO is going up. Allies are working more together. There are more troops forward positioned in vulnerable places like the Baltics. I mean, I still think it's too little and it's too slow, and a lot of aid to Ukraine is still too late. But we're holding our own, and as a reaction to what happened in Ukraine, actually NATO and the EU are beginning to get their act together a little bit better. We survived the Hungarian presidency of the EU, and Poland is now the president and has just committed this week to moving forward on Ukraine's accession to the EU. And perhaps for this audience, something that's potentially beneficial is that the UK and the EU started working together extremely well on Ukraine and coordinated very closely on sanctions. So those are sort of good things that may be a result of a very bad thing, but they're actually sort of changing. They're changing the dynamic in Europe, and they've given Europe a bit of a kick up the backside, which I think it needed. And the same, I would say, applies in the Middle East. I mean, the Hamas attack on Israel was absolutely ghastly, and I have lain awake thinking about the hostages. I have friends who had relatives who were hostages and who unfortunately didn't survive. And I have an extremely good friend who lives in Gaza and has been living in a completely desperate situation the last 12 months, lost his home within the first weeks of the war, has lost close family members. And as you can imagine, is sort of every day is a struggle for survival and massive psychological pressure. And then Israel's response, not only in Gaza, but also attacking Lebanon and making inroads in Syria. But, and I don't like to say this because it's an uncomfortable truth, but Israeli actions have actually led to Hezbollah, an undeniably malign influence and a proxy for Iran, being critically weakened to the extent that for the first time in many, many years, Lebanon has actually installed a president and a prime minister, neither of whom were the choice of Hezbollah. So something is happening in Lebanon. They've installed a competent economist, and Lebanon's economy has been in absolutely dire straits, partly as a result of Hezbollah misgovernance. So potentially out of the destruction of the Hamas and the Israeli-Gaza war, potentially Lebanon has a new start now. And undeniably, the collapse of the Assad regime would not have happened without the war between Israel and Gaza and Putin's invasion in Ukraine, which distracted Russia from its presence in Syria. And again, that does open up hope for the Syrian people. It's by no means certain that the new leaders will be able to form a cohesive new society, but I think it's undeniably good news that the Syrian regime has gone. And I also think it's good news that Iran is on the back foot. It doesn't mean it's not still dangerous. I do worry about its attempts to get a nuclear weapon and its alliance with Russia, and whether Russia will be tempted to share more nuclear technology with Iran. Iran is definitely on the back foot right now, and I think that's a good thing. And then you've got China. And again, I would say China's overreach, whether it's aggressive geopolitical ambitions in the Indo-Pacific, or its hostile activities against the West, its spying activities, its attempts to buy up critical national infrastructure, its anti-competitive economic policies. These are all producing a backlash. And again, I've just been reading this week that not just the US, but also the EU are beginning to introduce measures restricting Chinese access to our markets unless China opens up its own economy and removes some of its unfair practices. It's also raised awareness of the vulnerability of our critical national infrastructure to countries like Russia and China. So you're getting to see some onshoring and some de-risking and some attempts to protect our critical national infrastructure. And China's economy is overly dependent on exports. It's got excess capacity in quite a lot of sectors. It's had a housing bubble, and its repressive political system means that accurate information doesn't reach its leadership. So it continues to take very bad political decisions. So China's economy is not in great shape. And you have allies in Asia, democracies in Asia also beginning to work better together. They've all had a lot of in Asia, you've had a lot of countries with historical rivalries between them, like Japan and Korea or Vietnam. But they are beginning to work together because all of them see a threat from China. So you have India upping its presence in the Pacific and building up its navy. You have the AUKUS deal. You have the Quad grouping of Australia, Japan, India, and the US providing a sort of regional security framework. You've got ASEAN, some of whom have close relationships with China, so this is by no means straightforward, but a lot of ASEAN countries also trying to hedge against that risk of a rising China. And then you still do have life in democracy. I mean, in the UK, there was a reaction to 15, however many years it was, of appalling Tory misgovernance. I'm going to lay my cards on the table here. I hate the Conservatives with a passion that cannot be downplayed, since they led to the end of my career and monumental misgovernance of the UK. And the British people booted them out, which is great. You had in Poland, there was a reaction to the authoritarian tendencies of the previous government. You have a new government in power there. You've seen electoral setbacks to powerful ruling parties in India, Turkey, and South Africa last year. I think things that nobody would have envisaged. I mean, everyone assumed that in India, Narendra Modi's party was going to sweep the polls, and they didn't. And they've actually had to govern in coalition for the first time ever. You've got ongoing resistance to the steal of the election in Venezuela, with the Organization of American States and many individual Latin American countries not recognizing the Venezuelan government. You've got somewhere dear to my heart, you've got protests in Georgia. The Georgian people I think, are in their 44th day of public protests, pushing against the rigged elections there. You've got protests in Serbia. You've got Moldova refusing to allow Russian money to buy their election. You've got Romanian judges throwing out an election and saying you must have another one because of Russian money. I think all across Europe and the sort of democratic world, there is a growing realization of the dangers of Russian misinformation, Chinese misinformation, the ability of artificial intelligence to sow disinformation. So you're beginning to see some measures to try and push back on that. Okay, so I will just end with a little bit on Donald Trump, who is sucking up all the airwaves. And it's certainly true that for many people in my sphere, for many traditional foreign policy figures, the worry is that Trump is just going to throw even more marbles on the floor of this disorder, that his instincts are authoritarian, he doesn't care about rules and institutions. He's made some appalling nominations for some of his critical foreign policy, security, and intelligence positions. I'm just going to go and throw out there that arguably, I know I'll probably get some pushback here, arguably, his election is a reaction to the disorder that was already out there. And it's precisely because American voters felt America was projecting weakness, and that weakness is what has allowed countries like Russia to get away with invading Ukraine, China to pursue its aggressive ambitions, and so much chaos to unfold on the world. And Trump's election is a reaction to that. And if we're honest, the invasion of Georgia in 2008 and the overreach of the invasion in Iraq happened on George Bush's watch. The reset with Russia, which I think many of us think in hindsight was a mistake, the seizure of Crimea in 2014, which went unpunished, and the failure to enforce the red line in Syria in 2014, that all happened on Obama's watch. Obama ceded ground in the Middle East to Russia. And then sorry, that happened on Obama's watch. And then on Biden's watch, you had that absolutely disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan. And so many Americans have told me, like regular voters, during the campaign, I spend a lot of time chatting to people on doorsteps and at the polls. I was an observer at the polls. That experience of the US withdrawal from Afghanistan, I suspect, was the final signal to Putin that America is no longer a serious player. It was such a humiliation. America abandoned its Afghan allies. It left behind to fall victim to the Taliban, people who'd worked with US forces or British forces in Afghanistan. The situation for Afghan women is now absolutely horrendous. It's the worst strategic defeat since Vietnam. So maybe we're really going to stir things up here. Perhaps actually the best thing that has happened is that Biden is leaving office and that Kamala Harris was not elected. Because I don't think Kamala Harris would have offered anything different to reverse this sense of growing weakness and disorder. And in the election campaign, I mean, I campaigned for Kamala Harris. I don't want Trump to be president. I campaigned for Kamala Harris, but she was unable to say what she would do differently from Biden, economically, politically, or internationally. It was going to be more of the same, drift and decline. So it's not that I'm blind to Trump. This is probably a Hail Mary, as we say in American football. This may all be wishful thinking. I think it's just possible that Trump may be able to establish some global deterrence, maybe not in the way that we like, and in a way that is probably uncomfortable for Europe. But Europe's been coasting on America for so many decades. And a lot of other parts of the world actually welcome Trump's election. The world has not got better for them under Biden. And they see some hope in Trump's election. And I think the reason that we've got this news of a potential deal in Gaza is because of the incoming Trump presidency. It may be due to the legwork of Biden and his team, but what pushed that deal over the edge was fear of Trump. So I'm going to end with going back to my son's school. And when I was homeschooling him, during the pandemic, I had to go all the way back through my science and math and school classes. And we were studying the laws of physics. And the most basic law of physics is that for every action, there's an equal and an opposite reaction. I think it's this sense of crisis, this sense of disorder that is finally producing a reaction. And it may just about be the kick up the backsides that we've all needed to try and get ourselves back in order again. And may that also include the UK, the Labour government being a bit bolder on the EU. So I'm going to end there. And I'm welcome to take any questions.
Thank you, Alex. No, that was very, very good points there. I think I was reminded a bit of, I think it was Macron said recently that in a world of carnivores, it's not a good idea to be to be a herbivore, or words to that effect. And it made me think, actually, well, in a world of lions, I think at the very least, don't be a wildebeest, to be a buffalo. Work together and be strong, even if you're not going to do what they do. And maybe that is the lesson for the EU that, yes, as you said, it is the kick up the backside that it needs to actually get together. I just want to, one of the things I've noticed in the last few months is you've mentioned the protests in Georgia. I think they're actually on the 49th day, not evening now. And they had a strike today, actually, as well, a general, a very widespread strike, at least. I'm not sure if it was a general strike, but it was, And I think that is inspiring to see them turn out night after night through the cold with their Georgian flags, with the EU flags. I think that sends a powerful image. I just wish it got more coverage here. But also, there have been protests in last week in Slovakia against the Fico government, and earlier last year against in Hungary against Orban. So certainly there are people pushing back in a lot of countries against the authoritarianism, and I think that is something that we need to take hope from. Um, and in terms of question, how do you see this pushing the current status in the silver lining, the wake-up call, pushing the UK and EU to work together and other EU states to work together? As I say, with Trump, is he forcing us to do things we should be doing anyway, more quickly?
Well, I think the UK is actually, I'm afraid I think the UK is in an absolutely awful situation right now. I get very depressed thinking about the UK because we are, I mean, right at the start of Brexit, I always had this image in my mind. It immediately leapt into my mind, and I used to use it all the time when I was working in the embassy in Washington and thinking about, I mean, my job was to present the opportunities of Brexit, but I could think of all the risks. And the image that always jumped in my mind was of the UK with one foot in Europe and one foot in America, trying to maintain good relationships with both. But if Europe and America drifted further apart, what would happen is a bit like for any of you who've been punting in Cambridge or Oxford, and you've got one foot on land and one foot on the punt, and you don't make the leap definitively one way or the other, and you suddenly find your legs are getting split and eventually you splash in the water. But as long as you had a president like Joe Biden committed to the transatlantic relationship, the UK could comfortably try to work with the EU and the US because these weren't choices. But Trump is going to force a choice. If and there's quite a lot of worry that if we want to avoid Trump slapping tariffs on the UK, the sort of unsubtle price will be that we look to gear our economy closer to the US or look to do a trade deal with the US and abandon this effort to keep aligned with EU regulations, that we sort of entrench the Brexit divide. But economically, obviously, the EU remains our best hope of kickstarting our economy. It's a huge single market, and the frictions of Brexit have been devastating to our economy. And so there is a worry that we'll be faced with a choice. But and economically, our interests clearly lie with the EU. Any trade deal with the US is not going to be on particularly good terms or attractive ones. But our security still depends on the US. I mean, we don't have an independent nuclear deterrent. Our armed forces are absolutely pitiful. They are way too small. We're dependent on the US through NATO. So if we had a government, I mean, the arrival of Trump and the arrival of this sort of new geopolitical sort of great power politics, if it forces the EU to get its act together, then is it enough to push enough people in the UK to put pressure on the Labour government and Starmer to find some gumption finally to say, this is ridiculous, we have to sort of retool. We can't do anything unless we kickstart our economy, and we can't kickstart our economy unless we draw closer to Europe. And with a bigger economy, we'll be able to invest more in defence. So we are going to have to make that choice. So from that point of view, Trump might be a good thing. But from what I've seen of the Labour government so far, I'm not 100% optimistic. They are still running scared of voters and worrying about freedom of movement, worrying about, the will of the people, the backlash from Nigel Farage, giving their political opponents grounds to say we're selling out to Brussels again. And the other problem we have is that the EU is not in particularly brilliant shape. France and Germany are both very weak and divided right now. So do you hit So and if we did go back into the EU, it's obviously going to be on far worse terms than we had before. So it's a very hard political sell. So I think for the UK, this is going to be a really tough moment. I don't know which way it's going to play out because we don't know how it's going to play out yet with Trump. We don't know how it's going to play out in the EU. But I do just think the UK is so vulnerable right now, and I'm very worried about that. I do worry about that sort of, you know, as Europe and the US drift further apart, the UK is sort of smaller and friendless and plops in the middle. There's that cheerful answer. Sorry. At least some
Well,
of you are smiling at me, which I'm grateful for.
yeah, just before actually, somebody had a good question, which I'll lead into kind of something I was going to ask myself. But are there any positive things that you see at an individual or group organization level going on across the world and Europe, and you could probably say the UK as well, as a counterpoint to Elon Musk's Courage and the axis of reactionaries? Um, I know there's a broad question of what should we be doing almost as individuals to, what should we be lobbying our MPs to do? What organization should we be getting involved with? What do you have any suggestions or thoughts on that?
Okay, thank you, Leo. And I'm also going to pick up Joe's question about, oh no, sorry, different question. So one of the positive things I see is that Elon Musk and Steve Bannon seem to be at each other's throats. And Musk seems to be arguing with Nigel Farage, and this is not a very cohesive administration. The worry is that then it's just 4 years of chaos and disorder. The positive aspect of that is the ideological rifts and ideological incoherence of the Trump administration may limit some of its wilder ambitions. So if you're asking me about some positive things at an individual level, and then again, the organizational level, I mean, you're catching me on the hop here. I can't come up immediately with any specific organizations, but I would say that it's a pendulum, as I saw somebody said earlier on. There's a reaction. There's going to be a reaction to things unfolding in the Trump world. There's a reaction to what's happening in Russia, Ukraine. The EU is going to have to spend more on its own defense. They are going to have to figure out how to survive. And again, as I mentioned in Asia, I would say the Quad grouping is good news. I think Asian democracies, if China becomes too ambitious under Trump, they will hedge, and that will force them to come closer to the US and democracies. If China is put back in its box by Trump, that's also a good thing. So, yeah, I think there will be forces. I mean, the European movement is growing. I mean, a lot of you are members of Grassroots for Europe. I mean, I would say all of us are organizing in different ways. I've changed so much in the 4 years since I left the Foreign Office. I've joined groups, started working in fora. There's a discussion in the UK about how to reform our political systems as a result of Brexit. So I think all those things will happen. In the US, picking up Joe's question about might there be a civil war in the US, I hope not, and I don't think so. I think the moment of maximum risk was if Trump had lost the election and his supporters decided they didn't accept that. I think that would have led to a very, very frightening scenario. But nobody disputes that Trump won fair and square. So I think the risk of disorder was at that point. You will have individual states putting in place measures to try and protect education or health or women's rights. There will be a sort of a patchwork. And I still think the US system of checks and balances will hold to some degree. For example, there are Republican members of Congress who did not support Trump and Musk's desire to raise the debt ceiling last year. There were 36 members of the House of Representatives who defied him and said, no, we don't support that. you will have a lot of members of the House of Representatives facing election in 2 years' time. JD Vance does not have the alleged charisma of Donald Trump. How people find Trump charismatic is completely beyond me, but he does not have the same charisma and appeal as Donald Trump. So members of Congress who are looking beyond Trump will calibrate their positions as they have to run for re-election. And a lot of what Trump is proposing is not popular. I mean, he's not going to invade Greenland. He doesn't have a mandate to do that. So he's bullying Greenland, and the Danes have said they're willing to talk privately to Trump about it. But Trump doesn't have a mandate for so many of the wild policies that he's suggested he's going to do, and there will be a backlash to it. I'm trying to read all these messages as they're coming in. Okay, all right.
There's one from Michael Clegg, which looks about the if Trump and global Trumpism represent a reaction to the failures and weaknesses of post-war liberalism, how is that liberalism in its broadest sense revived? How does liberalism become the answer rather than Trump?
Haha. Don't have all the answers, but I think, and I wrote a lot about this, I'm going to talk more about this in the US context, but I hate saying this because I am a liberal to my bone. We have to look at why Trump won and why Farage has attracted adherents. And we can't just dismiss Americans as all stupid, bigoted, racist, homophobic morons. It's just not true. We have to understand that there is a backlash to Democrat identity politics. And there is a sense that the so-called woke agenda went too far. Some of his weaponization of these sort of sensitive woke cultural issues struck a chord. He may have weaponized them in a very nasty way, and I don't like some of the nastier aspects of the rhetoric around minority groups. But in my kids' school, and I'm choosing my words carefully here because I don't want you to think that I've become some bigoted reactionary myself. But I have to say, in the schools that my kids have been going to, American public schools, it is actually quite amazing. Their reading list last year, like 90% of the books would be what would be called were not English classics. They were social media, they were social agenda books, pushing a social ideology on our kids. And there is a backlash to that. So I think liberals need to understand why some of their policies are provoking a backlash, and why that, and Biden, and Kamala Harris, she accused, I mean, she was very skillful in the debate with Trump, and when she was asked about immigration, she was able to say, look, it was your guys who blocked an immigration bill in the Senate that was run on a bipartisan basis and was drafted by a leading conservative senator. And it was you, Donald Trump, who instructed your representatives to block it. And she was right. In the last year of the Biden administration got serious about immigration. But for 3 years, the first thing the Biden administration did when he came into office was abolish all the Trump controls on the border. And millions of people crossed that border. And there was no security along the border with Mexico. And there was a backlash to that. So I do think liberals instead, and after the Trump election, and I'm sorry because I'm thinking on my feet, and I apologize if this not, I'm not a politician, I'm not very smooth in how I speak always. After the election of Trump, I was quite shocked by the media, by the commentary on a lot of social media of like, right, so Americans are all racist bigots who like who like rapists and who don't care about the rest of the world and who don't care about anybody else. And that's just not true. I don't buy that. And if the reaction of liberals is just to deride people who vote for Farage or Trump, we're going to continue to lose ground. So that's what I'll say there. I think it's very patronizing, some of the critiques of Trump supporters.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, that is one of the, I think that's the thing a lot of us have noticed actually. There was that kind of combination of the anger at the border, the cost of living, the identity politics, but also the weakness. I think people sensed weakness in the Biden administration, and they never liked that in a government. So yeah, I think there's a lot more going on than just prejudice in how people voted, and I think we need to recognize that. And I think that maybe feeds into more of a in terms of liberalism, it's how do we create a society where people feel secure because there has been this growing security, and maybe I saw the other day I was thinking maybe the bond markets leading us into dictatorship. It's there's elements of that as well, and then what do we do to square that circle of having to operate within a particular economic paradigm and while still preserving freedom and support for the for a liberal society in the small L liberal way. You've got an interesting question here is from David Walmsley is how likely is it that the new normal is Trump consolidating his backyard, such as Greenland, Canada, and allowing Putin and Xi to a free hand in theirs?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's a optimistic scenario, which may be far-fetched and may be wishful thinking, which is that Trump establishes global deterrence and China is deterred from pursuing its geopolitical ambitions, and Putin is held at bay. I mean, I do dreadfully worry that Ukraine will be forced to accept a highly unsatisfactory peace deal, and Putin will have been rewarded with some territory in Ukraine. But it might be enough to hold Putin at bay. And also, Israel and America may be able to hold Iran at bay. And I'm not saying I like Netanyahu, I'm not saying I like Trump, but I definitely think holding Iran, China, and Russia at bay are good things overall for the world. So there is an optimistic scenario. A worse scenario is that Trump does what the hell he likes in his backyard, and that gives free rein to China, and he doesn't really care what China and Russia do in their backyard, so long as he can do what he wants in his sphere. And then that leaves Europe completely abandoned to the wolves, unless we also improve our own deterrence and can ramp up our security very rapidly. Otherwise, we just become lambs to the slaughter as we get ripped apart by Russia, China, and now the US, all sort of tearing off chunks of our security and our security interests. So those are sort of two different scenarios. The third scenario is just everything is disordered and messy for the next 4 years and unclear. Under any scenario, the best thing Europe can do is get our own house in order. I mean, we have coasted. I mean, I just sort of cannot understand how Scholz in Germany still doesn't seem to get the message. And countries like Spain, just, thinking they can coast along, investing less than 2% of their money in their own security and still doling out money. And France still resisting raising the retirement age. We can't afford to go on like this. This is a really tough political moment. So my worry is, can our democracies throw up the kind of leaders that we need who can set out honestly to our electorate what's at stake and persuade our electorate that some hard choices need to be made? And that is my biggest worry. And I look in Europe, and I don't see it. I see populists pandering to their population and either bribing them with more social handouts or pandering to their most nativist instincts about immigrants and minorities. And I see Macron as the most eloquent, but he, in trying to establish and set out a case for Europe reforming itself, establishing some strategic autonomy. But unfortunately, Macron is very unpopular because he's seen as very high-handed. And but the challenge for us in Europe is if we're not going to be ripped apart, whether it's by Russia or by a disinterested US or an aggressive US, we have to get our act together. We have to vote for leaders who can lead us through this. And so far, our democracies are not producing that. And that's the challenge for us, is finding those leaders. And I think Keir Starmer is a decent man, but I don't think he's a bold enough leader. Sadly, he came in on a massive mandate. He should have grabbed it, been bold in his first 6 months, I think. I'm interested in what other people think on that.
I've got a good question actually from Leo Capella actually here. Going into internationalism, how can we now show positive developments at the local level? Sorry, how can we show how positive developments at the local level connect to the global level and vice versa? Is there?
Okay, so there was a question earlier on about, given the disproportionate, this came from Peter, given the disproportionate advantage for the right wing through the Senate structure and electoral college, the hijacking of the Supreme Court and other flaws in the Constitution, what is the probability of the secession of blue states, particularly if Trump crosses any red lines? I don't personally see that as likely. What I do think, and the reason I'm linking these two questions, is the best pushback to authoritarianism or to the excesses of the red states is for the blue states to show they can govern more competently and more successfully. And that is the advantage of the American political system, that it does devolve so much local power to state level, economy, health, schools, family policy, environmental policy. A lot of it is state-led. So the best answer to the authoritarians is if communities, towns led by Democrats, states led by Democrats can show that their governments are more successful.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I think that there is that level of organizing. I think organizing at the fairly local level is going to be quite key, and actually at the national level as well. And that's where I did notice that there's an all-party parliamentary group on Europe being set up within Parliament, and that's a good step because it will hopefully start pushing more for action to take place and putting pressure on the government and others to actually develop a stronger relationship with Europe. But I think there are certainly issues where an environment is possibly one where I think we need to work together. But it's actually quite difficult to do that to show the connection, I think, sometimes between I know with water quality in the UK, that's been affected by Brexit because a lot of the protections that were there are no longer there. But I think it's often quite difficult to do it in a positive sense rather than a negative sense. I mean, that's something we need to do more. So I'm just scrolling down a bit.
I love all these comments. It's really great. I like this one. It's really difficult to be passionately extremist for the cause of centrism and moderation. I think that's a really great comment. But I am passionately moderate. I am a passionately extreme moderate, if that's not a contradiction in terms. I think we have to be have the courage of our convictions, and be willing to be sort of bold in making the case for moderation, if that makes sense. The other thing is, I think the other thing I don't like that is sort of a political development, and Israel Gaza is the sort of classic case of this. You know, the discourse on social media has been so utterly vile as the Israel Gaza war has unfolded. If you express any sort of sympathy for the hostages, then you are a genocide supporter. And if you express any sort of sympathy for Gazans, you are a terrorist sympathizer. And of course, these positions, this is just a nonsense. It's possible to hold two thoughts in one's head at the same time. And on issue after issue after issue, this sort of extreme polarization is really is so damaging on. And I find, as someone, you know, maybe it's my diplomatic training, I've always been able to hold two thoughts in my head, on the one hand, on the other. You can recognize this, you can celebrate the fall of Assad, but recognize that what may follow may be worrying. You can, I mean, I'm thinking aloud, but you could all think of scenarios like that. And I think we need to make the case for holding two thoughts in one's head at the same time and pushing back against these black and white extremes. And Tony Blair was brilliant at it. I always thought he was very good at sketching out complex political developments and making them accessible. I mean, you don't have to sell out to Europe. You can recognize that improving our trading relationships is a good thing. I mean, anyway, you get the point.
So I think we need to finish very soon. We're on 7:30 now. So just one final thought. With is the unmasking of social media, in a sense, that there's no longer any dispute about the biases intrinsic in a lot of social media channels now, with Musk and what we've seen with TikTok's involvement in elections in Romania, etc., or was it Moldova there? There's the role of social media and maybe the growth of blue sky as an alternative. Is there a sense of maybe that there is some hope to be found in how people are perceiving social media, and maybe people will be somewhat more skeptical about it in future, and maybe not not assign it the role it has had in the last few years by default almost?
Say that's already happening. I mean, I don't know how many of you have also managed to wean yourself off Twitter, and how many of you are now on Blue Sky. Anyone sort of wave their hands or shake their hands? But, you know, a lot of us have already made that decision. But we weren't, I think a lot of us who have kids are becoming wary of the toxic influence of social media. So we may not, you know, we may be keyboard warriors, but I mean, I have a friend whose daughter got sucked into anorexia and very unhealthy dieting practices because of what she was getting exposed to on social media. I have two boys who are very unfortunately have heard of Andrew Tate and are on social media the whole time. You've got the US trying to ban TikTok. You've got governments trying to regulate access under 16 to social media. You've got schools trying to introduce curricula on learning to become an intelligent consumer of information. So all those things are sort of happening as a reaction. So yeah, I think, again, when, you know, I think about the crack cocaine in the US inner cities in, I think it was the 1980s, eventually so many people were dying from this addiction that actually people began to wean themselves off it. People realized they weren't going to take that. Same with the opium. and the opioid crisis here in the States. The tide on that is beginning to turn as people are finally realizing how dangerous fentanyl and all these chemicals are. So I think there's a learning process for human beings. So, the best improvement comes from ourselves.
That's a good message to end on, and I think and also be inspired. I'd say the people you see in Georgia and Slovakia and Hungary. Just I think it's sometimes when it's very bad here, is to remember those people out in the streets waving flags and banners and willing to risk getting arrested or beaten up and or worse. I think there are people willing to fight the good fight, and I think they should remember that and not try not to let them down. So, I'd just like to thank Alex for joining us tonight. It was a very interesting conversation. Interesting times ahead, I think we all agree. And I think, thank you very much. Just before I go, I'll just say one thing. We have on the 25th of January, there is a European Movement Action Day. I think there'll be events taking part in various parts of the UK. It'll be focused on This is Erasmus, which is a new European movement campaign on the Seeking to Rejoin Erasmus Plus scheme, which I think is something that is quite achievable, actually, I think, in the next year. So I think this is something we really want to push. So if you're a member of the European movement, please find your local group and see what they're doing there on that. I will post what we're doing here. But I think...
Oh, I like Anthony inviting me to Cambridge. Yes, please. Sorry.
Absolutely, yes, I forgot to say, do. I'll just everyone in a meeting here.
Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, this is a very complicated world. I'm sorry that I'm not, perfectly eloquent. You asked some great questions. I'm thinking on my feet, trying to make it real, but don't despair. Be passionately extreme and, keep some hope and some faith. So.
Right. Thank you very much. We'll try and do that. I think the next few months will test us on it. Thanks.
Yeah, I know. In 4 days' time, we'll see. I mean, Trump's inauguration speech, my God. But at least this time round, we're better prepared. I mean, we know, he's a bit more of a known quantity this time round. So yeah, we're braced. Buckle up.
Yeah, and there are hopeful things. I think with the Gaza agreement, I think that is genuinely hopeful because he did obviously put pressure on Israel, which I think most people weren't expecting. So that's clearly something that's happened. So, and he seems to be conceding that he won't be able to sort out Ukraine in a day. So I think there's a recognition it's not just up to the US and Russia there, that there are Ukraine obviously has a voice, a very important one, but also European allies, and maybe with people like Tusk and the Polish Prime Minister there are and Kaja Kallas and various others who are actually leading essentially the European resistance to autocracy to a certain extent. I think we can take some inspiration from that as well. But anyway, I will let you go, get back to your day, and thank you very much.
Enjoy your gin and tonics. You'll need them.